Hey, Daniel.
Hey Owen, how are you doing?
Doing well. Yeah, happy October Friday the 13th.
Yeah, spooky season. It's the perfect time to be talking about this.
Exactly. Yeah, what do you got?
Well, like most people my age, when slightly older, I was introduced to the Raven from The Simpsons.
Hmm,
So I thought we'd just start there.
might as well.
Might as well. Might as well get it out in the open.
Mhm.
I like that segment of The Simpsons just because it's the original Treehouse of Horror. It's the one that all of the other Halloween specials are named after. And what is funny about that is that Bart and Lisa are like really blasé about the poem, but Homer's the one who ends up really terrified about it.
Mhm.
And there's something about the spookiness of the Raven isn't about horror and gore and terrifying things. It's about existentialism and the realities of death. And so that's always a good time to start talking about in October when everything's starting to get dark again.
Exactly. Which is also funny. It goes along with Catherine Lord's short stories. They're not also horrific and everything.
For
So
sure.
it's like another set of similarities.
Yeah, this creeping sense of dread is just embedded in all of these gothic Victorian tales. It's partly because it's not censorship exactly, but like the social understanding of what is acceptable to print is very different from what we, 21st century people deal with,
Yeah.
obviously. But it's also like Edgar Allan Poe is sort of, in a real way, like the progenitor of a lot of this stuff. So like he's inventing a lot of this, the mood and the tone of the gothic is being invented in this point in time. So like he's trying out new stuff that hasn't been seen before, and so it seems really tame to us. And that's what Bart says. It's like if you go back to the original, I think he says it's the Freddy Krueger movie or Nightmare on Elm Street, he's like, it's pretty tame by today's standards. And so like the Raven isn't a scream a minute sort of poem, and of course, like poetry isn't necessarily supposed to make you jump in the way that other things are, but it is that still has that sort of edge of terror attached to it, which is really great. And I'm sure that most everybody who's listening to this has read it even before you read it for them.
Mhm.
It's Edgar's most popular piece. Everybody knows about the Baltimore Ravens. They're named after this piece, and this is sort of his like greatest creation,
Yeah.
quote unquote.
Yeah.
And I love it. Like frankly, a lot of people at the time, so there was a mixed reception. A lot of Americans at the time were like, "This is not very good."
Yeah.
I think Ralph Waldo Emerson called him the jingle man. Like he was making like advertising jingles because of the way that all of his poetry has
Oh.
this very sort of hyper rhymey,
Yes.
very metrical sort of sense to it. But like Elizabeth Barrett Browning in London loved it, and everybody in her circle of writers was like, "This is amazing." So
Oh.
yeah, so Poe's has always had a sort of mixed reception, partly because as a writer he was writing in America, which didn't have a literary scene.
Oh.
That's what all the Europeans said, and he also was like, "Yeah, our American stuff is sort of provincial and not very worldly, and I want to change that. And I personally am going to change that by writing some of the greatest things ever written."
Great.
And so he was author, poet, but also a literary critic. So he spent a lot of time pointing out how not very good American writing was. And so people got super annoyed at him for doing that, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of hostility that's not necessarily based on the actual literature, but like some of it's really personal.
That's like,
Some of it-
oh, you suck, so your poetry sucks.
Yeah, basically.
Yep.
And there's the additional, and this is sort of a problem, it's not really one. So at the same time, actually slightly after The Raven is published, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson are starting to write their poetry, which is very, very different from the kind of thing that Poe writes. So it's much freer, it's less rigid in its metrical, it doesn't count syllables quite so much. Walt Whitman basically starts writing free verse in a lot of his pieces. And so like, on one way of thinking about it, Poe's like at the very, like the crest of the wave of really highly rigid poetry that then sort of fades away for the next 150 years. We don't worry about, today especially, we don't really worry about like what meter the poem is in or following particular forms. And so The Raven is really, really formulaic, and I don't mean that in the sense that it's copying somebody. I mean it's like really rigidly constructed,
Yes.
so that each stanza does the same thing the stanza did before, and like it's all very internally referential, sort of like he wrote 8 sonnets in a row,
Right,
and like that
right.
kind of very structured understanding what's going on. On the one hand, it's like the preeminent sort of peak of a particular kind of poetry, but it's also sort of like the last gasp of that specific style of poetry too.
Isn't that crazy to have that in the same poem? Just like be at the peak, but then also be one of the last.
Yeah. And so it was real popular for like everyday people, because that back in the 1800s, people actually read poetry like for fun. Sorry, all the poets in the room. He published it, I think, in January or February of that year. And then the next year, he comes out with an essay called The Philosophy of Composition,
Oh.
which is his explanation for how he wrote The Raven. And so he like has this very systematic, I decided I wanted to have a particular tone, I decided I wanted to play with a particular poetic device. He talks about the refrain, and so he invents the idea. He says he invents the idea. He comes up with the idea of using the word nevermore as a refrain, and then he comes up with the idea, and he says this is new. He's going to use the word over and over and over again, but each time it appears, it's going to mean something different.
Yes.
And so instead of having a refrain, which is a full line, it's just that one word. And so that one word appears over and over again. And so whether or not he invented that is I don't think that's really true, because Poe's a big self-starter, so he definitely claimed he invented it, but I doubt that that's the case.
Gotcha.
And then the philosophy is it's hard to know. We're not sure. It's hard to know how accurate it is because he's written it a year later. And it's also hard to know like how serious he is when he's doing this. Like is he being a little sarcastic? It's sort of, I don't know, it's so systematic the way that he's put it out there. It feels really neat. He says poetry is just an exercise of the brain, so it's very intellectualized, and it might just be a justification for things after the fact rather than actually experiencing it. But his goal with it is to say poetry isn't this romantic idea of just an outflowing of emotion that we then put on paper. Poetry is a craft and a skill that requires thought and work to make function.
Oh.
Samuel Coleridge and Wordsworth and the other romantic poets who were 40 years earlier, that's how they like talked about their poetry, as if inspiration came from somewhere else, and then the outflowing of emotion is just written on the page. And Poe's like, no, that's not really right. Poetry, you want to have a particular effect that you're trying to get to, therefore you decide on the kinds of language you're going to use, you pick out your content to get that effect happening. And that is the essay where he semi-famously says the most beautiful thing in the world to write poetry about is the young woman dying, because of all of the contingent emotions that go along with that. So this melancholic understanding that everything is temporary, and beautiful women, of course, lovely to write about anyway. And so that's why Poe writes about dying women constantly, because he seems to have honestly thought that that was the most beautiful thing in the world. Which gets us to the Raven. So, like, the Raven story is about the narrator, who is identified in the philosophy of composition as like a young scholar. So somebody who really into his books. There's a reason why the bust of Pallas, who's, the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is there in the poem, is haunted by the loss of his lovely Lenore, who's probably fiancé, is probably roughly what I would call her. And what happens in the poem is that the Raven appears and seems to sort of presage the like ultimate disillusion of the narrator into madness, because he's, lost his love. Like a lot of what Poe does, it's not really clear how much of this experience is quote real, quote unquote, or just like internal to the narrator's experience. So like we have a bunch of people on opium trips in Poe, or like dying and having hallucinations in Poe, because he's very aware of the fact that like we're writing something, we're writing fictional thing, and he likes to play around with what is real and what is not real. And so he talks about, so that the Raven appears, and the Raven can only ever say the word nevermore. And so the narrator is asking questions of the Raven, knowing that the only answer he's ever going to get is nevermore. So that he starts to ask really innocuous questions, and then starts asking the really deep existential questions like, will I ever see my love again? And the answer is no. The narrator knows the answer is going to be no, and he's asking it so that he gets told no, so that he can feel the melancholic sadness of Lenore.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's this cycle of masochism, basically, or he's like luxuriating in his own sadness. And whether that means he's actually going mad or he's just seasonal affective disorder, it's not really clear. So that we don't know if the narrator is going mad or he's just like luxuriating in his own sadness, and the end of the poem is ambiguous enough that it could go either way. The fascinating thing about the Nevermore refrain, as I said, is that it's just one word, and each time it appears at the end of the stanza, it has a slightly different meaning. And so, like, the narrator is manipulating that understanding by essentially putting words in the Raven's mouth, by asking him particular questions and getting the same stock response each time. The Raven is itself, like, being sort of Poe's stand-in. So Poe knows that Nevermore is going to appear differently every time, so the Raven becomes sort of Poe talking back to his own narrator in a weird way.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's this really deeply cyclical thing that I think Poe is smart enough to pull off. Like, I don't think I'm making that up. I'm pretty sure Poe is doing that on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that because of how the rhyme schemes tend to work. So the rhyme schemes are all really self-referential and circular. So the internal rhyme scheme, so rapping and tapping and so on. But the Raven still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and bust and door. And then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, with its grim, ungainly, ghastly gaunt, and ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking nevermore. So, like, the internal rhymes are, like, calling you to the front, to the end of the line, so thinking and sinking. Mm-hmm. And then they're also calling backwards to the previous, the line up above the one ahead of them. And they're all of them are, like, set up so that when you say the word nevermore, it's very different from all of the other rhymes that came before it. And that happens each time in each stanza. Yeah, and this is why I think it was Emerson called him the Jingle Man. Because of its rigidity, it has the sort of radio jingle, like, feel to it. Even, like, nursery rhymes have a very specific sort of pattern to them in the way that the sound works. And so because he's doing that, he's relying on a repetitious sound, it can actually be very, like, sonorous. You can actually start to, like, hypnotize yourself reading it because your brain starts to expect particular kinds of sounds and you sort of get lulled into the same sort of dreamlike state that the narrator is in at the beginning.
Gotcha.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Wow.
Did you have any questions or
man,
thoughts that you noticed while you were reading it?
So many, actually. I talked with a buddy, Charlie, about the poem, and I sent my version off to him, and he gave me some feedback. And some of the feedback was that the narrator that I read as wasn't scared, and there wasn't fear. And that's because I read it as him being drowsy in the beginning, you know, and then him being curious at the door, and then him looking out and getting Lenore coming back and forth. And then I didn't really do the fear at the curtain and the Raven coming in. I think I just missed that, or maybe it was so quick that it just flew right through because he opened the window right away. And then he saw the Raven and he was curious about the Raven. And then the Raven went up to the bust and he was curious again. So mine was a lot less fear from the narrator, and then it turned into anger, right? Because he was asking those questions at the end where it's like, you Raven, why are you telling me that Lenore's dead and I'll never see her again? So like, those are all the different questions of like, what emotions would you see in the narrator throughout the poem?
So going back to The Simpsons, I don't think that your emotional arc is that unusual.
Okay.
Curiosity, like drowsiness, curiosity, concern. Homer Simpson's a little afraid because it's dark and stormy. A little bit afraid.
Yeah, they added thunder to a lot of other poems that I read, and I was like, okay.
Yeah. And then anger at the end, he's shouting at the Raven.
Exactly.
I don't think that's a bad interpretation of what's going on there, because one way of responding to grief is with anger. But there's something I think to be said for reading it quietly. And so, like, you can change the questions into questions of, like, despair, where you, like, sort of accept the fact that it's inevitable that the Raven is going to say nevermore. So whatever question I ask, it's always going to be nevermore, and you can have it get quieter and quieter. It'd be less dramatic, but, like, that potential emotional reading, I think, is in there.
Yeah.
Apparently, Poe used to read this poem out loud, or actually like perform it in front of people.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they'd douse all the candles, and he'd have one lamp, and he'd like spooky season right in front of his face, and he would do it. And it used to, apparently the literary salons loved it, because it is a really fun poem to read out loud. And Edgar Allan Poe could be real dramatic when he wanted to be, as you can imagine. Yeah. So, yeah, I think those final questions, definitely moments where he starts using those exclamation points much more often. So, like, there's definitely a shouty quality to him, especially because he's now insulting the raven, calling it a wretch, calling it all of these things. So the angry part is definitely part of what's going on. But, you know, he's not really angry at the raven. Right. He's angry at the thing the raven represents, whatever that thing is.
Right. Yeah.
And so, back to the philosophy of composition, what's fascinating is that it says in there that Poe initially thought, oh, if I have a refrain that's just a word, I have to find a logical reason why that word keeps coming up. And he said a human being would never just continually say nevermore. Yeah. But what if I imagined something that could or would just say one word over and over again? And so he's like, oh, a parrot. And then he was like, that's the wrong vibe. A raven. Yep. And so apparently, I did not know this, the raven itself is based on a raven from one of Dickens' novels called Barnaby Rudge, which I have never heard of.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and in Dickens, the raven is like a jokester comedic figure. So like he talks a little bit, but he's the comic relief. Wow. Because he does things, people don't do. Yeah. And so Poe like simplifies what the raven does by like making him only do one thing. And then the nevermore thing becomes a logical part of the poem because ravens can speak. I don't actually know that this is true. Like I've never heard of ravens actually talking, but there was a sort of 19th century understanding that they could speak, and so like they apparently can mimic human voices well enough, like parrots, to sound like they're talking. Mm-hmm. So the raven has the logical part of the poem, and so like Poe's in the philosophy of composition, he's like, everything in the poem derives from a logical understanding of things. So I said it in December because it's likely to be stormy and dark, rather than it being like, oh, it's spooky and it rhymes with ember and all of these other things. So like, oh no, I have a logical reason why I'm going to do this. And that's partly why some people are suspicious of his philosophy and saying, this seems like you're after the fact justifying a lot of your choices, which don't really need justification. You don't really need to justify that it's December. It could just be December, or December just rhymes with a lot of interesting words, and so we can just have December. I mean, he definitely picked Lenore as the name because it rhymes with nevermore, and he'd even written a poem called Lenore before this poem. Oh, interesting. So he'd already used the name before because Lenore rhymes with lots of words. Okay, yeah, and because he's super into rhyme, much more than other people would have been. So like, I won't say that other people weren't into rhyme, but he's like very into very specific, not very many slant rhymes, very perfect rhyming all the time. See what I did there? Yeah. Perfect rhymes all the time. And that's what he liked to do. And so he uses a lot of words that have lots of rhymes because he wants to have multiple rhymes that aren't repeating each other. So like all of them. So thinking, sinking, drinking, all of those sorts of things are perfect rhymes and are strong rhymes rather than slant rhymes or weak rhymes. Oh, yeah. So I'm trying to think if there was anything else. Oh, the philosophy of composition. One last thing. Probably not the last thing. One more thing. That's where he also expounds on his idea that a piece of poetry or literature should have one singular effect, so it should all be headed in one particular direction. It's also where he says that a proper piece of literature should be something you can read in one sitting. So that's why he says he spends most of his energy on short stories and poetry, because those can be read in one sitting and therefore can have one effect. Whereas if you read a long novel or a long poem, you eventually stand up, re-enter the world, and then have to go back into the novel. And so you can't have a singular effect. It's not possible to do that. Right. And so what he says for long works is that you end up with singular effects in chunks, and he'd rather do a singular effect to go in one direction. That's great. Yeah, the goal of the Raven is to get you to feel that existential dread that the narrator feels, and that's the whole purpose of the poem. And according to Poe, every choice he's made is directing you in that specific direction, and all of them are necessary to get you to the heightened sense of the feeling of the poem at the end. Now, American people, and English people don't really take the philosophy of composition seriously at the time. They're like, fine, Poe, that's a nice idea, whatever. But the French take the philosophy of composition very seriously, and so Poe has always had a higher reputation in France than he has in the English-speaking countries. And so Charles Baudelaire and a bunch of other French poets take that idea of singular effect and start to use it as their explanation for what their poetry is supposed to be doing. So Edgar's more continental and European than his like bumpkin American colleagues are.
Well, I mean, he found his audience, so that's pretty cool.
He did.
Yeah, so there's a couple big time names that have read The Raven before as well. So, Christopher Lee.
For sure. Dracula himself.
Yeah, he did a version of it that was much more subdued and much more dread-filled and everything. And oh my gosh, it's amazing. So if you haven't listened to Christopher Lee narrate The Raven, go find it. Vincent Price did The Raven as well. And in his version, it's weird. There's some words that are wrong and some pronunciations that are much different than what I expected.
That's interesting.
It's very interesting.
I know he was in the film The Raven. Was the poem in the film? That's a good question. I don't know.
It was like a theatrical reading where they filmed it, and he did all the actions and stuff. And at the end, he laid down on the floor and acted to be dead. So that was my other question, was when his, not soul, what was it that they said, left the floor? At the very end.
Yeah, my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Is that what you're thinking of?
Yep, that's the part. So at that part, I was wondering too, did the narrator die in that scene?
Again, ambiguous. I think probably he's being more metaphorical than like soul, like literally leaving the body and dying. But like, I think you could make the argument that he's despairing so much that he has in fact died. And so like, in that case, it would be, the poem would be about the death of a beautiful woman and of a young scholar at the same time. And that would be extra melancholic and sad. So I think Poe would probably approve of that.
Cool.
And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So the other way of reading it is like, because Lenore's gone, he'll never be able to elate his soul. He'll never be able to experience any sort of happiness ever again. He's always going to be in the shadow of the Raven, who's never going to leave his bust of Pallas. And so if we get real symbolist like interpretation of what's going on, the bust of Pallas is like, the head of a statue. So it's Athena, the skull of Athena, with the shadow like perched on her head. In the philosophy of composition, he's like, this is a brilliant thought that I had. Like, the Raven is really black, the marble bust is really white, the two things contrast each other really strongly, and so that image will stick in my audience's head really well. And that kind of worked in 1845, but now most of my students don't know who Pallas is, so I have to explain, one, what a bust is, and two, who Pallas is. And so, like, it's lost in translation. But if we think of Athena as, like, the source of all wisdom, like the brain, and the Raven perched on top of the brain, there's this moment where you could be like, oh, the Raven's actually about clinical depression, which is this thing just sort of pressed upon the psyche constantly. And the end of that poem sort of points out that, like, no matter what I decide to do, no matter how many questions I ask or how much research I do, I'm always going to be under this shadow of this thing perched upon me. Like, this trauma, this grief will always be with me in a very, like, serious sort of...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's that was another thought too, was like he would never change, and then the nevermore, him never leaving the bust, was also another question of like, well, what does that mean? But you explained it well.
What does that mean? What does that mean? It's always a really good question.
Yeah.
I'm actually just looking at the 1963 Vincent Price The Raven film, which I haven't seen. Apparently it's slightly funny.
Oh, okay.
It says it's a comedic gothic film. But it's got Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, and Boris Karloff.
Oh, wow.
And Jack Nicholson.
Wow.
How old would he have been? Damn. Jack Nicholson as the son of Peter Lorre. That's interesting.
That's crazy.
So, yeah. So Vincent Price was a big Edgar Allan Poe fan and made, I don't know, like 7 or 8 Edgar Allan Poe, like, not adaptations, but based on films. So he would take just plot points from various things and sort of make his own sort of plot based on stuff.
Oh,
so like The Pit and the Pendulum short story by Poe is literally just a guy watching the pendulum get closer and closer and killing him. Well, that's not really a film. Like, there's not enough there to justify making a film. So you take that scene or that sketch from Poe and you put it into an additional sketch from Poe and make a full-length feature film out of it.
Okay. Yeah.
So I haven't ever seen The Raven. I'll have to watch it. It's probably a good year to do that.
Exactly.
Fair enough.
Why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to bring up. This is his most famous poem. He has a couple of other ones. Annabel Lee is, again, about a dying woman. I think it's literally just called The Bells. But they have very similar sort of... Yeah, it's called The Bells. So they have very similar hypnotic rhyme schemes with a very specific sort of... All of them are different in the sense that none of them have the same sort of meter to them, but all of them have a really structured, highly evocative meter. So The Bells... Hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of the night, while the stars that oversprinkle all the heavens seem to twinkle with a crystalline delight, keeping time, time, time in a sort of runic rhyme to the tin tabulation that is so musically wells from the bells, 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 from the jingling and the tinkling of the bells. And so he's mimicking like bells right there, right? Because you hear the ringing over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And so, The Raven's his most popular, famous poem. It's probably his best. If anybody likes The Raven, I strongly suggest you go read Annabel Lee or The Bells or his other poetry, just because it'll awaken your senses to the sound qualities of The Raven, like what all of the like nuances of his rhyme scheme and meter are doing. So, I think that's probably what I had to say about The Bells. Like, you literally say the word bells 8 times in a row at the end of every refrain because that's what he was trying to get, the sort of constant clacking of the bells across to you.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So, I guess, boiling it down, what is the takeaway of The Raven?
The takeaway of The Raven is that death is always there. Mm-hmm. There isn't really a way of dealing with it there's no concrete way of dealing with it, let's say that.
Okay.
It's an inevitable sort of thing that's going to have to be dealt with because that's what being a human being is, but there isn't like a solution. There's no like one weird trick to get over death.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's really good. Because I mean, the Raven just sits there forever.
Yep, it's just there forever. And grief is not a passing thing. It's just a thing that exists and it just keeps existing.
Yep, exactly. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I think happy Halloween, y'all.
Yeah, happy Halloween.
I think that worked. Woohoo! Don't listen to it with the lights off because it is very spooky.
Yeah, and if you have tapping that happens in your house, listen to it in the morning.
Don't answer the door. Yeah. Like basic horror film rule. Do not answer the door.
Sweet. Anything else on your docket that you want to promote?
Let's see. On the Victorian Legacies podcast, we are recording Carmilla Vibes, which is our Halloween special this year. So last year we did Dracula Vibes, and it's just a round table of us chatting about Dracula. And this year we're doing Carmilla, which will be fun. So we'll cross-pollinate podcast audiences, and then I can send this one to the Victorian Legacies people.
Yeah.
And then I'm working on my Hyena and Nosferatu paper.
Oh.
So I don't know if I told you about that or not. So Nosferatu is the adaptation of Dracula, and there's a hyena in it, and I'm getting closer. To figuring out what the hyena is doing there.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, over here, we're just putting out episodes of Lady Audley's Secret.
Keep on reading out loud.
Will do.
Sounds like a plan.
Cool.
All right.
Talk to you later.
Talk to you later on.
Bye.
Bye.